April 11th, 1942, 11:20 hours. Bataan Peninsula, Philippines. Mile marker 23 of the march. Private First Class Toshio Yamamoto of the Imperial Japanese Army's 14th Division stood guard duty along the roadside, watching thousands of American and Filipino prisoners stagger past in the scorching Philippine heat. The temperature had reached 38 degrees Celsius by mid-morning. The prisoners had been marching for 3 days without adequate water, food, or rest. Many were already wounded from the Battle of Bataan. All were exhausted, starving, and dying of thirst. Yamamoto was 24 years old. Born in a farming village in Kumamoto Prefecture, drafted in 1940, trained in traditional Bushido warrior code, and taught that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, that soldiers who surrendered deserved no mercy, that prisoners were beneath contempt. He'd been deployed to the Philippines in January 1942 as part of Japan's conquest of Southeast Asia. The orders regarding prisoners had been explicit. March them to Camp O'Donnell, 65 miles north. No provisions needed to be made for their comfort. They'd forfeited all rights by surrendering. Guards were authorized to beat or kill prisoners who couldn't keep pace. The Imperial Japanese Army viewed these men not as prisoners of war entitled to Geneva Convention protections, but as cowards who'd chosen dishonor over death. Yamamoto had watched the march for 3 days now. He'd seen prisoners collapse from heat exhaustion and be bayoneted where they fell. He'd seen men shot for asking for water. He'd seen guards beat prisoners unconscious for walking too slowly. He'd seen the roadside littered with bodies, Americans and Filipinos who died of dehydration, starvation, exhaustion, or violence. The brutality should have seemed normal. Yamamoto's training had taught him that these men deserved their suffering. They'd surrendered instead of fighting to the death. They'd violated the warrior code. They were less than human. But Yamamoto couldn't convince himself of that. Every time he looked at the prisoners' faces, he saw not cowards, but defeated soldiers, men who'd fought for months against overwhelming Japanese forces, who'd held out far longer than expected, who'd surrendered only when further resistance became impossible. They looked like soldiers. They looked like humans. They looked like they were dying of thirst. Near mile marker 23, Yamamoto was posted at a roadside position where prisoners passed close enough to hear their desperate pleas. Water. Please. Water. The words came in English and Tagalog, from American and Filipino prisoners alike, all begging for something as basic as water and heat that was killing them by the hundreds. Yamamoto had a canteen, full. He'd filled it that morning from the supply truck. Japanese guards had plenty of water. The logistical failure that left prisoners without water was deliberate policy, not resource shortage. Prisoners were meant to suffer. Their suffering demonstrated Japanese military superiority and punished their cowardice in surrendering. An American prisoner, young perhaps 19 or 20, with captain's insignia barely visible on his filthy torn uniform, stumbled as he passed Yamamoto's position. The prisoner caught himself, stood with visible effort, and looked directly at Yamamoto. Their eyes met. The American didn't speak, didn't beg. He just looked at Yamamoto with an expression that conveyed everything. I'm dying. You have water. You're a human being. Please. Yamamoto's training screamed at him. These men are not your concern. They forfeited consideration when they surrendered. Helping them violates orders. Your duty is enforcing the march, not showing mercy to cowards. But Yamamoto looked at that young American captain dying of thirst, maintaining dignity despite everything, asking for nothing more than water, and made a decision that violated every order he'd received and everything he'd been taught about proper conduct toward prisoners who'd dishonored themselves through surrender. Yamamoto pulled his canteen from his belt, unscrewed the cap, and handed it to the American prisoner. The American stared at the canteen for perhaps 2 seconds, unable to process what was happening. A Japanese guard, offering water? It contradicted everything the prisoners had experienced during 3 days of deliberate brutality. Then the American took the canteen with trembling hands and drank, not desperately gulping. He controlled himself, taking measured swallows, making the water last. When he'd drunk perhaps a third of the canteen's contents, he stopped and tried to hand it back to Yamamoto. Yamamoto gestured for him to keep drinking. The American drank more, then reluctantly returned the canteen. He nodded once, a gesture of gratitude that transcended language barriers, and rejoined the march, moving with slightly more strength than before. Yamamoto stood there, canteen in hand, aware that he'd just committed an act that could get him court-martialed or beaten by his fellow soldiers, if witnessed. Showing mercy to prisoners violated orders. Giving water to men meant to suffer violated policy. Recognizing prisoners' humanity violated the ideological framework that justified their brutal treatment. But Yamamoto couldn't convince himself that what he'd done was wrong. He'd given water to a dying man. That seemed more fundamentally correct than any order demanding he withhold it. Over the next hour, Yamamoto repeated the act 4 more times. Each time he waited until no other guards were watching closely, then offered his canteen to prisoners who seemed closest to collapse. Each time, the prisoners' reactions showed the same disbelief. Japanese guards didn't give water to prisoners. Guards beat prisoners for asking for water. A guard offering water voluntarily was incomprehensible kindness. By noon, Yamamoto's canteen was empty. He'd given away water he needed for himself in the Philippine heat, but 5 prisoners who might have died from dehydration had received enough water to continue the march. 5 men who'd been taught that Japanese soldiers were inhuman monsters had experienced unexpected mercy from an enemy. Yamamoto knew the risk he was taking. If his sergeant discovered what he'd done, punishment would be severe, possibly execution for showing mercy to prisoners. But he couldn't bring himself to regret the choice. Those 5 men had needed water. He'd had water, providing it had been the only moral option his conscience could accept. That day on the Bataan Death March, one Japanese soldier chose humanity over orders, mercy over cruelty, and his own conscience over military discipline. It was a tiny act of kindness in a systematic campaign of brutality, but for 5 prisoners dying of thirst in the Philippine heat, it meant the difference between life and death. The Bataan Death March, April 1942, represents one of World War II's most notorious atrocities and a profound stain on the Imperial Japanese Army's conduct. The numbers documented systematic brutality: approximately 76,000 prisoners, 12,000 Americans, 64,000 Filipinos, forced to march 65 miles in extreme heat without adequate food, water, or rest. Estimates suggest 650 American deaths and 10,000 Filipino deaths during the march itself, with thousands more dying in the following weeks from injuries, disease, and malnutrition sustained during the ordeal. The march occurred after the largest surrender in American military history. On April 9, 1942, Major General Edward King surrendered approximately 76,000 American and Filipino forces on the Bataan Peninsula after 3 months of desperate defense against Japanese invasion. The defenders had fought far longer than Japanese planners expected, tying down forces needed elsewhere and inflicting significant casualties. When surrender became inevitable, ammunition exhausted, food gone, disease rampant, reinforcements impossible, King made the agonizing decision to spare his men from suicidal final assault. The Imperial Japanese Army was unprepared for so many prisoners. Japanese military culture viewed surrender as ultimate dishonor. Bushido warrior code demanded fighting to death rather than capture. The concept of humane prisoner treatment contradicted Japanese military ideology. Additionally, logistical failures, resource shortages, and deliberate policy decisions meant prisoners received virtually no provisions during the march. The conditions were catastrophic. Prisoners marched in groups of approximately 500, 1,000, with Japanese guards forcing the pace despite prisoners' weakened condition from months of combat, inadequate rations, and disease. The Philippine climate, temperatures regularly exceeding 35 degrees Celsius, high humidity, created conditions where dehydration could kill within hours. Prisoners had no water except what they could scavenge from contaminated sources along the route. Guards beat prisoners who fell behind, couldn't maintain pace, or asked for water. Many prisoners were bayoneted or shot for inability to continue. Some guards conducted sun treatment, forcing prisoners to sit in direct sunlight without water or shade until they died of heat stroke. Prisoners who stopped to help fallen comrades were often killed alongside them. The cruelty wasn't occasional excess by individual guards but systematic policy, reflecting Japanese military contempt for men who'd surrendered rather than fighting to death. Survivors' accounts documented the horror. Men dying of thirst watched Japanese guards pour water on the ground rather than share it with prisoners. Guards bayoneted prisoners for asking for medical care. Officers beat prisoners unconscious for minor infractions or no reason at all. The march became a deliberate campaign of suffering designed to punish prisoners for the dishonor of surrender and demonstrate Japanese military superiority. In this context of systematic brutality and official policy demanding prisoner suffering, individual Japanese soldiers who showed mercy became extraordinary exceptions, demonstrating that humanity could persist even in circumstances specifically designed to destroy it. To understand Yamamoto's decision to help prisoners, one must understand the ideological framework he was violating. The Imperial Japanese Army operated under Bushido Code, ancient samurai warrior ethics, adapted for modern military use. Core principles included absolute loyalty to emperor, death before dishonor, contempt for surrender, and belief that Japan's military culture was superior to Western values. Japanese military training systematically dehumanized enemies and especially prisoners of war. Soldiers were taught that Western soldiers lacked Japanese spiritual strength and fighting spirit. Americans specifically were portrayed as soft, decadent, lacking martial virtue, unworthy of respect. Surrender proved these claims. True warriors never surrendered, so men who surrendered proved they lacked warrior spirit and deserved contempt. The indoctrination was thorough and began early. Yamamoto, like all Japanese soldiers, had absorbed these lessons through years of military training, reinforced by propaganda, peer pressure, and the threat of severe punishment for anyone questioning official ideology. Officers who suggested humane prisoner treatment risked accusations of Western sympathies or insufficient loyalty to Emperor and Bushido values. The training also included specific instructions about prisoner treatment, or rather, lack of treatment. Prisoners were entitled to nothing. Providing them comfort was weakness. Showing them mercy was betraying Bushido principles. Guards who felt sympathy for prisoners were failing their duty. The proper attitude toward prisoners was contempt, mixed with the understanding that their suffering was self-inflicted punishment for the dishonor of surrender. Yamamoto had received all this training. He'd internalized the lessons about warrior honor, the contempt for surrender, the belief that prisoners deserve suffering. But watching actual human beings die of thirst while he had water created cognitive dissonance. His training hadn't prepared him for. The American prisoners didn't look like the caricatures Japanese propaganda portrayed. They looked like soldiers, exhausted, defeated, but maintaining discipline and dignity. They looked like humans, suffering, dying, begging for basic necessities. They looked like men who'd fought honorably and surrendered only when further resistance became suicidal rather than heroic. When Yamamoto handed his canteen to that first American captain, he was rejecting years of indoctrination, violating explicit orders, risking severe punishment, and choosing his own moral judgment over military ideology. That choice required extraordinary moral courage, not the physical courage of combat, but the ethical courage of defying authority to do what conscience demanded. The American prisoner who received Yamamoto's first offer of water was Captain James Donnelly, 31st Infantry Regiment, Philippine Division, 23 years old, from Boston, Massachusetts, West Point graduate, class of 1940, deployed to the Philippines in November 1941, arriving just weeks before Pearl Harbor and the Japanese invasion of the Philippines. Donnelly had fought through the entire Bataan campaign. 3 months of desperate defense against overwhelming Japanese forces. His regiment had suffered approximately 60% casualties. Donnelly himself had been wounded twice. Neither wound severe enough for evacuation. Both treated in the field and ignored as he continued leading his platoon. By the time of surrender, Donnelly weighed perhaps 120 pounds. He'd lost 40 pounds from disease, inadequate rations, and combat stress. When the surrender came, Donnelly struggled with shame and relief simultaneously. West Point had taught him that officers never surrendered. American military culture, while not as extreme as Japanese Bushido, still viewed surrender as profound failure. But continuing to fight meant certain death for men under his command, and death wouldn't accomplish anything. Ammunition was exhausted, reinforcements impossible, further resistance would be suicide rather than military necessity. The first 3 days of the march had been horror. Donnelly's training hadn't prepared him for. He'd expected hard captivity, forced labor, inadequate food, harsh conditions. He hadn't expected systematic murder. Watching Japanese guards bayonet prisoners who fell from exhaustion, shoot men who asked for water, beat prisoners unconscious for walking too slowly. This wasn't war, it was deliberate sadism. By the time Donnelly encountered Yamamoto at mile marker 23, he'd gone without water for approximately 14 hours in 38-degree heat while marching. He was experiencing early stages of severe dehydration, dizziness, inability to concentrate, muscle cramps, dark urine, desperate thirst that dominated all thought. He'd estimated he had perhaps another 4 to 6 hours before dehydration became fatal. When he stumbled near Yamamoto's position, he expected to be beaten or shot. That was what happened to prisoners who showed weakness. Instead, a Japanese guard offered him water. The cognitive dissonance was profound. For 3 days, every interaction with Japanese guards had involved violence or threatened violence. Guards were monsters who delighted in prisoner suffering. They were the enemy, not just in military sense, but in moral sense, evil men doing evil things. But here was a Japanese guard voluntarily offering water to an American prisoner, risking punishment to show mercy, recognizing prisoners' humanity when every other guard denied it. Donnelly drank carefully. His dehydration was severe enough that drinking too quickly could cause vomiting, wasting precious water. He forced himself to stop, after taking enough to stave off immediate danger, trying to leave some for Yamamoto who'd need it in the same heat. When Yamamoto gestured for him to drink more, Donnelly did, then reluctantly returned the canteen. He wanted to thank Yamamoto properly, to express gratitude that transcended the simple nod he'd given. But there was no time. The march continued. Guards were watching. Drawing attention to the exchange would endanger Yamamoto, so Donnelly rejoined the march, carrying with him the memory that even in the death march's systematic brutality, individual Japanese soldiers could choose mercy. That water and the humanity Yamamoto demonstrated in offering it probably saved Donnelly's life. He survived the march, survived Camp O'Donnell's disease and starvation, survived 3 years of captivity, and returned home in 1945, weighing 98 pounds but alive. In every interview he gave about his captivity, to military debriefing officers, to historians, to his family, Donnelly mentioned the Japanese guard who'd given him water on the march. He couldn't describe the guard's appearance precisely. All Japanese soldiers looked similar to American prisoners, and Donnelly's dehydration had affected his perception. But he remembered the act itself, unexpected mercy from an enemy when mercy seemed impossible. Yamamoto wasn't unique in showing mercy to prisoners during the death march, though he was exceptional. Most Japanese guards followed orders and maintained the systematic brutality that characterized the march. But a small number of individual soldiers, exact numbers impossible to determine, chose to help prisoners despite orders, showing that even in circumstances designed to destroy humanity, individual moral choice persisted. Private Hiroshi Tanaka, assigned to guard duty at a rest stop, allowed prisoners to fill canteens from a well when his sergeant wasn't watching. He couldn't provide water directly. Too obvious, too risky, but he deliberately looked away while prisoners violated rules against accessing water sources, giving them opportunity they desperately needed. Corporal Kenji Watanabe shared food from his own rations with Filipino prisoners. Not much. A rice ball split among 4 men, barely enough to matter. But given when prisoners were starving, those rice balls represented difference between having energy to continue march and collapsing from exhaustion. Watanabe conducted these gifts when other guards weren't observing, risking punishment to provide basic nutrition to men his training said deserved starvation. Lieutenant Masao Kobayashi ordered his squad to slow the march pace during the hottest part of the day, claiming tactical necessity, but actually reducing prisoner deaths from heat stroke. He couldn't stop the march or provide adequate water, that would be too obvious a violation of orders. But he could manipulate pace and rest frequency, using his authority as officer to create small mercies within brutal system. These acts of mercy were secret, limited, and dangerous for the Japanese soldiers who performed them. Discovery meant punishment ranging from beating to court-martial to execution for disobeying orders and showing weakness toward prisoners. The soldiers who helped prisoners did so knowing they risked their own lives to save enemy soldiers who weren't supposed to matter. The mercies were also inadequate. Yamamoto's 5 canteens of water couldn't prevent thousands of prisoners from dying of dehydration. Tanaka's permission to access a well helped dozens but couldn't address systematic denial of water to tens of thousands. Watanabe's rice balls fed a few men while most starved. Kobayashi's slower pace reduced deaths but couldn't prevent the march from being a death march. But the inadequacy didn't make the acts meaningless. For prisoners who received water, food, or slightly slower pace, these small mercies made difference between life and death. For the Japanese soldiers who provided mercy, the acts represented refusal to completely surrender humanity to military discipline. For the broader moral calculation, the mercies demonstrated that evil systems rely on individual compliance, and individual refusal creates cracks in systematic brutality. Yamamoto's decision to help prisoners created psychological burdens he carried for the rest of his life. The immediate burden was fear. Discovery would mean severe punishment. For days after giving water to prisoners, Yamamoto expected his sergeant to confront him, expected fellow soldiers to report him, expected punishment that would be harsh and public to discourage other guards from similar mercy. The punishment never came. Either no one had witnessed his actions, or those who'd seen had chosen to ignore them, rather than report a fellow soldier for showing mercy. But the fear persisted. Every time his sergeant looked at him, Yamamoto wondered if this was the moment of discovery. Every time fellow guards discussed prisoner treatment, he worried his disagreement with official policy showed on his face. The longer-term burden was moral conflict. Yamamoto had violated orders and ideology he'd been trained to follow. Had he betrayed his duty? Had he shown weakness unworthy of a Japanese soldier? Had his mercy toward enemies dishonored the Emperor and Bushido code? But Yamamoto couldn't convince himself that giving water to dying men was wrong, regardless of what orders said. Every time he mentally replayed his decision, he reached the same conclusion: withholding water from people dying of thirst was wrong, giving water was right, and if orders demanded wrong actions, then orders deserved to be violated. This conclusion was dangerous in Imperial Japanese military culture. Soldiers who questioned orders questioned authority itself. Individual moral judgment contradicted the military value of absolute obedience. Yamamoto couldn't discuss these thoughts with fellow soldiers without risking accusations of insufficient loyalty or dangerous Western sympathies. So he carried the burden silently, processing his moral choices privately while maintaining outward conformity to military ideology. It was a lonely position, believing something different from expressed military values, but unable to voice that belief safely. The march ended at Camp O'Donnell, a former Philippine Army training camp converted to POW facility. Conditions were catastrophic. Approximately 1,500 Americans and 27,000 Filipinos died at O'Donnell. In the first 2 months, primarily from disease, malnutrition, and lack of medical care. Yamamoto was assigned guard duty at O'Donnell for 6 months. The camp's conditions created daily moral crises similar to those he'd faced during the march. Prisoners were denied adequate food, water, and medical care. Guards were expected to beat prisoners for minor infractions. The camp commander's policy was deliberate suffering. Prisoners' punishment for surrender's dishonor should continue indefinitely. Yamamoto found limited ways to help prisoners despite restrictions. He warned prisoners when inspections were coming, allowing them to hide contraband or evidence of rule violations. He accidentally overlooked prisoners stealing food from Japanese supplies. He allowed prisoners slightly longer rest periods during forced labor when supervising officers weren't present. These were small mercies in a horrific system, unable to prevent thousands of deaths, but providing minor relief to men suffering systematically. And they continued Yamamoto's pattern of choosing individual moral judgment over orders demanding cruelty. Japan surrendered in August 1945. The Bataan Death March became focal point of war crimes trials. Guards and officers who'd participated faced prosecution for their treatment of prisoners. The trials documented systematic brutality, identified individuals responsible for specific atrocities, and resulted in executions and imprisonment for numerous Japanese military personnel. Yamamoto feared prosecution. He'd been present during the march, served as guard at O'Donnell, participated in the system that killed thousands. That he'd secretly helped some prisoners wouldn't necessarily excuse his participation in criminal enterprise. But Yamamoto was never charged. Either his specific actions weren't documented sufficiently, or prosecutors focused on guards and officers who'd committed obvious atrocities, rather than ordinary guards who'd followed orders without excessive cruelty. Yamamoto returned to his village in Kumamoto, resumed farming, and tried to process his war experiences privately. The psychological burden intensified in peacetime. During the war, survival and fear of punishment had focused Yamamoto's attention on immediate concerns. After the war, he had time and space to fully process what he'd witnessed and participated in. The Bataan Death March had been atrocity, systematic murder of helpless prisoners. Yamamoto had been present, had guarded men dying of thirst and starvation, had participated in a system designed to kill through neglect and brutality. That he'd helped 5 prisoners couldn't erase his presence during thousands of deaths. That he'd violated orders to show mercy didn't make him innocent of participating in war crime. Yamamoto struggled with guilt, shame, and the question of whether his small acts of mercy made any moral difference or were simply inadequate gestures that couldn't redeem participation in evil. In 1987, James Donnelly, now 68 years old, retired Army colonel, participated in a documentary about Bataan Death March survivors. During his interview, he mentioned the Japanese guard who'd given him water at mile marker 23. The interviewer asked if Donnelly knew the guard's name or any identifying information. Donnelly didn't. He'd never seen the guard clearly enough to describe him, had no way to identify him among thousands of Japanese soldiers who'd served in the Philippines. But he wanted to thank him, to acknowledge that in the death march's systematic brutality, one Japanese soldier had chosen mercy, and that mercy had saved Donnelly's life. The documentary producer, intrigued by the story, posted inquiries in Japanese newspapers and veteran associations, asking if any former guards who'd served during the Bataan Death March remembered helping American prisoners. It was unlikely anyone would respond. Admitting participation in the Death March risked prosecution even 45 years later, and few Japanese veterans wanted to discuss their war crimes publicly. But Yamamoto, now 70 years old and living quietly in his village, saw the inquiry. He'd carried the memory of helping those 5 prisoners for 45 years, wondering if they'd survived, if his water had made any difference. The documentary's inquiry suggested at least one had survived and remembered. Yamamoto contacted the producer through an intermediary. He wasn't willing to identify himself publicly but wanted to communicate with Donnelly if possible. The producer facilitated correspondence through anonymous channels that protected Yamamoto's identity while allowing communication. In his first letter, Yamamoto wrote, translated from Japanese, "I was a guard during the Bataan March. I gave water to several American prisoners when I should not have. I violated orders because I could not watch men die of thirst when I had water. I do not know if you were one of the prisoners I helped. I do not know if my water saved anyone, or if they died later in the camps. But I have wondered for 45 years whether any survived, and whether my small act of mercy mattered. If you were one of the men I helped, I am grateful you survived. If you were not, but remember another Japanese soldier showing mercy, I am grateful that mercy existed even in that terrible place." Donnelly responded, "I remember you. Not your face. I was too dehydrated to see clearly, and Japanese soldiers all looked similar to American prisoners, but I remember your action. I was dying of thirst at mile marker 23. A Japanese guard gave me his canteen voluntarily, without being asked. When every other guard had beaten prisoners for requesting water, that water saved my life. I survived the march, survived Camp O'Donnell, Survived 3 years of captivity and came home. I've had 50 years of life, marriage, children, career, grandchildren, because you chose to help me when orders said to let me die. I don't know what punishment you risked by helping me. I don't know why you chose mercy when systematic policy demanded cruelty, but I want you to know that your choice mattered. You saved my life and proved that even in the Death March's evil, individual humans could choose good. Thank you. In 1992, 50 years after the Death March, Donnelly and Yamamoto met in Tokyo. The meeting was private. Yamamoto still feared public identification, and both men wanted personal closure rather than media attention. They were both elderly men, Donnelly 73, Yamamoto 74. They looked at each other across 50 years, across cultural and linguistic barriers, across the guilt and gratitude that their 1942 encounter had created. Through an interpreter, they spoke for hours. Yamamoto described his experience during the march, the orders to show no mercy, the systematic brutality, his internal conflict between training and conscience, his decision to help prisoners despite orders, his fear of discovery, his guilt about participating in atrocity, even while trying to mitigate it. Donnelly described his experience, the 3 months of desperate defense on Bataan, the shame and relief of surrender, the horror of the march, the dehydration that nearly killed him, the unexpected mercy from a Japanese guard, the survival that followed. I've wondered for 50 years whether helping you was meaningful, Yamamoto said through the interpreter. 5 canteens of water in a march that killed thousands. Was it enough? Did it matter? You saved my life, Donnelly replied. That matters absolutely to me, to my wife, to my children and grandchildren who exist because you helped me survive. You couldn't stop the Death March. One private soldier couldn't prevent systematic atrocity, but you could give water to 5 dying men, and you did. That choice, to help when you could, despite orders and risk, that was moral courage. That was humanity persisting in circumstances designed to destroy it. Yes, it mattered. They embraced. 2 elderly men, former enemies, connected by a moment of mercy, 50 years earlier, that had saved one life and redeemed the conscience of another. The producer released the documentary in 1993, telling both Donnelly's and Yamamoto's stories, with Yamamoto's identity still protected, his face obscured, his name changed. The film sparked discussions in both America and Japan about individual moral responsibility in war, the limits of following orders as justification for atrocities, and the possibility of maintaining humanity in dehumanizing circumstances. In America, the documentary complicated narratives about Japanese war crimes. Yes, the Bataan Death March was atrocity. Yes, Japanese guards committed systematic brutality, but individual Japanese soldiers could and did make moral choices to help prisoners despite orders. The guards weren't monolithic evil, they were individual humans, most following orders, some choosing mercy. In Japan, the documentary was controversial. Some veterans groups criticized it for breaking the silence about Japanese war crimes. Others praised it for acknowledging that individual soldiers had made moral choices and showing that Japanese people could face their wartime conduct honestly. Yamamoto and Donnelly maintained contact until Yamamoto's death in 1998, at age 80. Donnelly died in 2005 at age 86. Both men spent their final years speaking to students, military personnel, and anyone interested in war ethics about the importance of individual moral choice, even in systematic evil. Orders can demand cruelty, Donnelly told a West Point ethics class in 2003. Systems can encourage atrocity, but individuals retain moral agency and responsibility for their choices. Yamamoto proved that in the Death March's evil, individual soldiers could choose mercy despite orders. That choice saved my life. It also preserved Yamamoto's humanity when everything around him encouraged him to surrender it. We need more soldiers like him. People who maintain conscience even when orders demand its surrender. The story of Yamamoto's water resonates because it challenges comfortable narratives about good and evil in war. The Bataan Death March was unambiguous atrocity, systematic murder of helpless prisoners, violation of every standard of humane conduct, inexcusable war crime. But within that atrocity, individual Japanese soldiers could and did make moral choices to help prisoners. Yamamoto couldn't stop the death march. He couldn't prevent thousands of deaths. He couldn't change the system that demanded prisoners' suffering, but he could give water to 5 dying men. And he did, despite orders forbidding it, and despite risk to himself. That choice matters on multiple levels. Practically, it saved lives, at least Donnelly's, possibly others, among the 5 who received water. Morally, it demonstrated that humans retain capacity for ethical choice, even in circumstances specifically designed to destroy morality. Politically, it proves that following orders isn't adequate excuse for atrocities, because individuals can choose to violate orders when conscience demands it. The broader lesson extends beyond World War II to any situation involving systematic cruelty and individual moral choice. Every atrocity requires individual compliance. Every systematic evil depends on people following orders despite moral qualms. Every dehumanizing system works because individuals suppress conscience in favor of obedience. But individuals can refuse. They can choose mercy when orders demand cruelty. They can maintain humanity when systems encourage its surrender. They can risk punishment to do what conscience demands. Yamamoto proved this on the Bataan Death March, and his proof matters for understanding human moral capacity in extreme circumstances. 75 years later, the story still teaches. Students studying military ethics examine Yamamoto's choice. What made him help prisoners when most guards didn't? What psychological and moral factors enabled him to violate orders? What can militaries do to encourage this kind of moral courage? The answers aren't simple. Yamamoto himself couldn't fully explain why he'd chosen to help prisoners. It felt right. Withholding water felt wrong. His conscience wouldn't allow passive observation of preventable suffering, but the inability to explain completely doesn't diminish the importance. Yamamoto chose mercy when orders demanded cruelty, maintained humanity when systems encouraged brutality, and demonstrated that individual moral choice remains possible, even in war's worst atrocities. That remains the enduring lesson. Orders can demand evil, but individuals can refuse. Systems can encourage cruelty, but conscience can resist. Atrocities require compliance, and individual refusal creates cracks in systematic evil. One canteen of water couldn't stop the death march, but it saved a life and proved that humanity persists when everything tries to destroy it.